I want to invite Jen Maidrand in just a moment after I say a word about her, who will introduce her mentor, Professor Kenneth Ngwa. Jen is a Louisville Fellow, which includes, fellows include women, you know, in that scholarly nomenclature, who is in her second year now with us, teaching in biblical interpretation and culture. A PhD out of Drew. She is a wonderful addition to our faculty. So Jen, would you come and introduce Professor Ngwa?
Thank you, President Marshall, for that kind introduction. Good morning. It is truly a delight to have the opportunity to introduce my dear mentor and friend, Reverend Dr. Kenneth Ngwa, to you all today. I've been allowed 2 minutes to offer this introduction, which does not feel like nearly enough time to offer you just a glimpse into the radiant scholar, teacher, pastor, and person that he is, but I'll do my best. I first walked into Dr. Ngwa's office at Drew Theological School, where he was a professor of Hebrew Bible. From what I remember as an overly eager student fresh out of undergrad, I had arranged to do an independent study with him my first semester as a master's student in order to work closely with Hebrew translation of biblical texts. We set out for the book of Genesis, but focused in on the creation narratives and did not get much outside the first 3 chapters all semester. I would often arrive at his office after tending to the theological school's garden, which I was then overseeing, and he continued to ask me how my relationship to land and to this particular soil was shaping my understanding of this ancient story and the translation choices I was making. Kenneth is an invitational teacher. I've witnessed him in the classroom time and time again invite students to offer their own interpretation of biblical texts and develop their own theoretical approaches, never rushing to offer correction of claims or reframing students' experiences based on scholarship or cerebral knowledge. Professor Ngwa is the kind of teacher whose classes students would talk about in the halls, wrestling with the new paradigm he had offered them for biblical interpretation, remarking on moving moments of transformation that took place in his classroom. The spaces that he creates for learning are invitational, and from my assessment, liberative to many. I remember hearing countless stories of revelatory moments that unfolded in the class that Kenneth taught on the book of Job and suffering in Northern State Prison in Newark, New Jersey. I cannot think of a better person to facilitate a learning community centered around the question of suffering among a diverse group of theological students and men who were incarcerated and brutally dehumanized by a system that had long since written them off as disposable. Beyond the classroom, Dr. Ngwa is an imaginative and rigorous scholar. In his most recent book, Let My People Live, an Africana reading of Exodus, he weaves together post-colonial and womanist hermeneutics, necropolitics, Afro-ecology, and liberation theology in order to offer liberative readings of the Exodus story that resist the forces of erasure, alienation, and singularization. One of my favorite parts of his book is his articulation of a badass womanism that he finds embodied by the women in Exodus and through the currents of the narrative itself. Badass womanism, he writes, quote, is an embodied epistemological and hermeneutical rising against patriarchal and colonial triads of toxic masculine singularity, disempowering alienation, and traumatizing erasure. End quote. Kenneth's scholarly contributions to Africana biblical interpretation and the field of biblical studies at large are robust. He's published a number of articles and book chapters and given a number of keynote addresses at the intersections of trauma and memory studies, eco-womanism, Afrofuturism, critical race theory, post-colonial and Africana biblical hermeneutics, wholeness and health, decolonial epistemologies, orality, wisdom literature and parabolic imagination, and dreams and dreaming. I'll not go into naming them here for sake of time. But speaking of dreaming, Dr. Ngwa is currently working with a grant from the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning, where he is exploring the role of co-dreaming for our personal healing and for the life and future of our faith communities. During his time at Drew Theological School, Kenneth founded the Religion and Global Health Forum, which brings together theologians, scientists, activists, and healthcare professionals to educate, advocate, and strategize around holistic health. Kenneth doesn't just write about liberative possibilities and pathways to collective flourishing. He works actively towards these realities in our world, drawing others into this work with mutuality and care. For much of his career, Ngwa has also been a pastor. He's pastored a number of Presbyterian congregations in Cameroon, New York, and New Jersey, several of them while being a full-time faculty member, I would add. His pastoral call is clear in his work on global health, his teaching, and the ways in which he's in relationship to others. Kenneth is an incredibly humble person, attuned to care for the whole person and spiritual communities. That first semester I worked with Dr. Ngwa, he urged me week after week to find my voice in the scholarly work that I was beginning to develop. At that point in time, I had no idea what that was. And he continued to invite me to consider it, to develop it, to plant seeds and grow it. You have shaped me in very important ways. And for that, I'm very grateful. And when that first semester came to a close, I probably awkwardly asked you how it is that I should cite the conversations we had in what I was writing, because surely these were not my ideas alone. His response to me was an invitation to consider the notion of Ubuntu, that I am because we are, that we are because of each other collectively. He offered to me that our ideas never come from no place. They come from our conversations with one another. They come from those who come before us, ancestors and others. Our ideas are always our ideas, not our individual ones. And so I'm confident that this kind of invitation is what we will hear from Dr. Ngwa today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Depending on the time zones, I imagine. We are gathered in this space, which is both in-person and virtual, to discuss, to celebrate the life of theological education. And so let me take this opportunity, first of all, to express deep gratitude to Jen for that wonderful introduction. In many ways, as I'm listening to her talk, I'm thinking, wow, I was lucky to work with her because she is very good. So to the president and to the dean and to the alumni, faculty, staff, student body, thank you for this invitation to be here. I am truly honored to be part of this homecoming celebration. As a Hebrew Bible scholar, I'm particularly delighted to have been invited to speak at an event that is partly supported by the Gustafson, who was a New Testament scholar. And so I feel invited into a space which is both academic, professional, scholarly, but it is also a space that opens itself up to interdisciplinary, cross-pollination, the kind of work that we all strive to do. I have some slides here. I'm going to walk through that, but I hope to go through as quickly as possible so that we can have some time for conversation. So let me make sure that my time is well spent. So I want to invite us this morning to think about a particular passage in the New Testament. It is Matthew 15, 21 to 28. And the title is A Daughter's Perspective on Liberation, a dialogical reading of Matthew 15. If we begin with asking the question about the why of liberation, why are we so committed to this work? The quintessential liberation story of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is the Exodus story. It is a story of a mixed multitude of people inspired by Yahweh to work for freedom. And so when I ask, what exactly is the nature of freedom and liberation in Exodus, I settle on the idea that it is a community's response to three major things that they face. One, and Jen alluded to this, is erasure. The second is marginalization. And the third is singularity or singularization. That these three constitute a kind of intersectional, intergenerational, and interregional form of oppression, or in other words, it is a story that invites all who are committed to the work of liberation to ask the following question: what exactly is the nature of liberation? Is it a matter of changing residential zip codes? To simply move from one location to another? And that if it is simply a matter of changing residential zip codes without addressing the underlying questions, then it might sometimes be the case that we simply transfer the problem from one place to another. And so the nature of liberation is to try and answer those questions, those ideological and practical concerns around erasure, marginalization, and singularization. And so I want to draw on some of that now to do a reading of this, of a text in the New Testament, which basically invites us to consider those three things. So the story, as we know, Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed from that moment. Let me identify a few things that happen in this story. The woman speaks first in verse 22, when she approaches Jesus. Before we hear her voice again, three things happen. The first we are told is that Jesus does not answer her. Simply ignores her. Ignores her determined words. That is, her story, her history is simply ignored. That amounts to a form of erasure. The second is that the disciples come and they ask that she be sent away. That, I suggest, amounts to a kind of marginalization. Send her away. And the third is that there is a certain understanding within the community that whatever this liberation work that Jesus is doing is very particular. It is only for some people. And so she is outside of that. And that thinking around the singularity of this story is what I also find in the liberation story of Exodus. And so for Matthew, who is writing this gospel and presenting Jesus as the new Moses, for the audience to hear the story, I imagine they would hear echoes of that long-standing liberation struggle. And so what I want to do is to invite us to consider the way in which this story continuously wrestles with those three ideological challenges in a way that moves us from just simply looking at what Jesus does or doesn't do to asking a larger question. Why is Matthew presenting the story this way? What kind of social work does this kind of storytelling do? And what is the expectation for the audience? Would anybody react in response to the manifestations of erasure, marginalization, and singularity in the story? What is erasure? I draw here on the work of Achille Mbembe, who's done some work on necropolitics. Achille Mbembe started writing in the 90s about necropolitics in the context of his own native country's struggles for freedom, Cameroon. And basically, he has given a definition of erasure that I find useful. And it's connected to notions of sovereignty. The quote is, "The ultimate form of sovereignty resides in the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die." So when the struggle for liberation is about a challenge to necropolitics, what is the alternative? What is it that communities that want to embody liberation would offer up as the alternative to necropolitics? A second framing for this is marginalization. And here I am drawing on the work of Totke and Burr, and from this book, Black Atlantic Writers of the 18th Century, who recount the story of Gronyoso, a young boy who was captured back in what is modern Nigeria and enslaved. And he recounts this story. He recounts this story in his own personal narrative about what that capture was. But this particular statement is important, so I just want to read it. So he observed that there was a merchant who would read prayers in public to the ship's crew every Sabbath day. And when first I saw him read, I was never so surprised in my whole life as when I saw the book talk to my master, for I thought it did. As I observed him to look upon it and moved his lips, I wished it would do so to me. As soon as my master had done reading, I followed him to the place where he put the book, being mightily delighted with it. And when nobody saw me, I opened it and put my ear down close upon it. in great hope that it would say something to me, but was so very sorry and greatly disappointed when I found that it would not speak. This thought immediately presented itself to me that everybody and everything despised me because I was Black. The visual here is of someone who is trying to find liberation and literally hugging a religious text in the hope that the text would speak to them. And then coming to the realization that there is something about that that doesn't quite resonate. A sense of marginalization. The third thing that I want to invite us to consider is this notion of singularity. And this is something I'm working out of theorizing around the work of Vincent Wimbush, who talks about scripturalization, that the way we read scripture is to ask the question, what do we allow scriptures to do for us? What work does scriptures do for us in the social macro structures of life? And alongside that, I engaged the work of Gerald West, who is talking about the stolen Bible. This is trying to address the question, how does a biblical text go from being a tool of imperialism to an icon? How does that happen? So in many ways then, if we think about erasure, marginalization, and singularity, then we are thinking about intersectional liberation work. It has to be intersectional because it is addressing these entrenched challenges. Let me use one more example, just to mention the ways in which this story is lived out. I take you back to 18th century Congo. On Sunday, July 2nd, 1706, a young woman was publicly executed after being charged with religious heresy. She was 22 years old. She was a citizen of 18th century Kingdom of Congo. Her name, Donna Beatrice Kimper-Vita. Even though her life was short-lived, she stands in an unbroken tradition and her story of a struggle that is as old as humankind, the struggle for freedom. It is a struggle that is personal, social, religious, political, and global. The Kingdom of Congo was one of the wealthiest and the most powerful states in the Atlantic region of Central Africa during the 15th and 16th centuries. But in the 17th century, it faced internal and external pressures, including war with the Portuguese-led military from Angola. Notably in the Battle of Nwga in 1665, at which the Portuguese troops killed the Congo ruler, Antonio I. By the turn of the 18th century, the Congo capital, Mbanza, Congo, also known as Sao Salvador, had been abandoned, and the kingdom had broken up into small territories ruled by warlords and members of the old nobility. It was during these years of colonial missionary activity that Kimper-Vita emerged as a religious leader and practitioner, someone who was going to invite her community to basically overcome the legacy of colonialism, imperialism, slave trade, civil war, patriarchy, and environmental devastation. And so her story invites us to consider the ways in which communities that are embarked on this work of liberation have to imagine real alternatives to what they challenge. Because in many ways, overcoming the system of oppression is only the beginning. The real question is, what is produced in its stead? For post-colonial thinkers, it cannot just simply be that liberation is a matter of changing who is at the top. Because we have found that there is the post-colonial autocrat, the strong man, that even in democratic societies, authoritarianism can emerge. Because the reality is, if it is simply a matter of changing who is at the top without addressing the underlying systemic problems, then we might find ourselves in a situation where an autocrat can replace a democrat. Or we can find ourselves in a situation where autocrats can stay on and on and on. So with that framing, I want to return, I'm going to skip over this. I want to return to the passage in Matthew, and through a lens of womanist hermeneutics, which talks about sanctified imagination. It's a word that Will Gaffney uses, sanctified imagination of the interpreter. I want to do a kind of midrash. This midrashic work is one that invites us to consider, how might the daughter of that woman retell that story? Which means I want to invite us to enter a space of intergenerational storytelling for the sake of liberation. So for the next few moments, I am just going to read now as if I am reading what this daughter would have written. I don't read this to claim that I know exactly what she would have said, or even to replace her. But I read this as a kind of imaginative solidarity with those who see her, hear her, create space for those who otherwise don't have a space to be able to articulate their own stories of liberation. So here goes. Good afternoon. My name is Kadeshtu. My mother, Justa, beat the odds 3 times over. Why? How? The answer is both complicated and simple, but it all had to do with her faith and her tenacity, her relentless pursuit of my liberation and hers. Part of her story and mine is recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Mark calls us Syro-Phoenicians. Matthew called us Canaanite. Bible translators often put subheadings to our stories, such as the Canaanite woman's faith or the Syro-Phoenician woman's faith. I am not sure what such subheadings are intended to convey. Are they signaling that, oh, look, we found one faithful one, one righteous one? For some people, my mother's faith was unusual because, after all, we were Canaanites. You wouldn't expect such faith from foreigners, would you? I had seen her faith at work before. It was a faith that was strong and that gave me my own dreams and my own determination to make something, not just of my life, but the lives of my community members. So when at the end of the story, Jesus says to her, "Woman, your faith is great," Jesus was telling the truth. My life was much richer than the episode recorded in the gospel. My mother gave birth to me and raised me in the twin cities of Tyre and Sidon, located at the foot of the mountain region of Lebanon. I loved it very much. It was something of a border town, caught up in the international trade, especially bronze. During the time of David Our king Hiram supplied cedars and craftsmen that helped build the nation. Our people assisted Solomon in building a temple in Jerusalem. Prophets like Ezekiel and Joel and Amos and Zechariah all talked about our commercial activities and our inventiveness. The Gospels record that Jesus attracted followers from the regions where we lived. For some people, that is a surprise. For me, it is not. Why? Because my mother's story and my story was consistent with the stories of many more people than are recorded in the scriptures. So what comes across as an exceptional individual was actually not. Because there were so many, like my mother, who did similar kinds of things every day. If you wanted to find people who worked for liberation, you could find them everywhere. It was just a matter of paying attention because you would notice them. Oftentimes working outside of the limelight in ways mighty and small, always pressing, asking the next question, inviting others to join them, never giving up, relentlessly pursuing that same concern of ours, which was, how do we free ourselves of these demons? The demons of imperialism and colonialism and patriarchy and heteronormativity. How do we free ourselves of the demons of environmental injustice and abuse? How do we free ourselves of the demons of racism and classism, of masters dropping the crumbs for others to pick up? Those were the demons I was fighting. And on this particular day, my mother decided to take our fight once more to the public. She had heard that Jesus was coming into town, and many people knew that Jesus was a man who had committed himself to the work of liberation. And so we went to see him. On this memorable day, my mother was determined, but I had seen her determined all her life. So when she lifted her voice and spoke, it was a sound and a tenor and a rhythm that I was familiar with. The Greek word, kraugazo, that is used to describe her cry, is often used to describe determined speech, spoken with authority and conviction. Her shout was not a shout of desperation. It was a shout of determination. As respectful as ever, my mother did not address him as Jesus. Instead, she addressed him by his status, Lord, Son of David, and then went on to state to the hearing of everyone that I was being tormented by demons. Then she made her first ask. She asked Jesus for a liaison. The Greek word would retrovert into the Semitic language as rechem, a word that means compassion, but in its fleshiness, it means womb, like a mother's womb. Jesus may have accessed our village on a road that was paved by empire, but my mother wanted him to confront the demons of empire. More than that, my mother wanted him to redesign, to work with us to redesign community values, its intellectual debates, its work, so that the health and the well-being of its citizens would not be a matter of episodic, sporadic, miraculous healing, and rather become entrenched, systemic, everyday experiences. That is what she was asking for. Because in order to do that kind of work, you have to have a womb, a fleshiness that makes it possible to see the thing that comes as a manifestation of a genuine kind of empathy and love. Erasure. To my surprise, the man simply ignored my mother. Not a word. Stone silence. I looked up to see if he was busy attending to another person. He wasn't. But his focus and attention was squarely on my mother. Now my story was public. Everyone was looking at me, but I had my eyes squarely fixed on my mother. I felt slightly guilty, the way children often do when they see their parents struggling to give them a better life. I realized that my mother was battling the same demons I was fighting, the demon that wanted to make her disappear, be marginalized and accepted, or feel as though she was not worthy speaking in that public space. Right at that moment, my mother turned and looked at me straight in the face as if to reassure me. She was a woman of faith. Her look, her determined look, gave me courage. Then right on cue, marginalization stepped in. Members of Jesus' entourage came in and said my mother should be sent away, that she was making noise and disturbing the public peace, that she was not allowed to express herself in the public space, that the space that for some time had been a shared space of expression suddenly now was a dangerous place to step into. What was happening in our town? How is it that our streets were becoming more and more dangerous for people who dared to speak up? So send her away was the demand from the disciples. I wondered to myself, were these really the followers of Jesus? And how would they interpret what my mother was asking Jesus to do? As I refocused on her, I wondered what is worse, to be ignored or to be sent away for supposedly being a nuisance. Clearly, my mother's way of expressing her faith and hope in public was not acceptable decorum for the disciples, the leaders of Jesus' group. They were looking for decorum. My mother was recreating the fleshy space of the womb, the place of empathy. Then singularity stepped in. Suddenly things looked really bleak again. The man said his mission did not include people like me, Gentiles. His words were, quote, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." When I heard those words, my feelings turned from disappointment to anger. Here was my mother publicly expressing her faith in God as one of love and empathy, and not only being rejected, but being told that she, and by extension me, were not in God's plan. I had a question for the man. Who sent you? What mission are you on? Who gave you that mission? Was it God? Did something happen to you as you walked the road paved by empire? I ask because the Semitic God whose womb my mother is appealing to actually produce all kinds of fleshy people. Canaanite fleshes, Jewish, Hebrew fleshes, Egyptian fleshes, Ethiopian fleshes. If you keep moving, you will find brown fleshes, black fleshes, yellow, white, queer, trans, every kind of flesh produced by this same divine womb. As I spoke, I felt a resolve in me, a determination to stand with my mother. She was not just my mother, she was also my advocate, my companion in the life of faith. Their resolve and determination were timely. They probably saved me from completely falling apart because of what happened next. My mother came closer to the man and knelt before him. What? Instead of going away, as the disciples urged, she came closer and knelt. If her words did not solicit a positive response from Jesus, maybe her physical kneeling would. But would it? She reset the table. This time she did not call him son of David, which would have been a nationalistic title. That was too limiting. Ethno-nationalism would not provide liberation. So she moved to a different kind of title. On her knees, my mother spoke, Lord, help me. The Greek word again, boitheo, would retrovert into Semitic as ezer. The response from the man cut deep. It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs. I gasped. My eyes were wide open. As I turned to look at my mother, I couldn't quite believe what I heard. I quickly scanned the audience to see their reaction. Some people were nodding in approval. Others were saying out loud, yeah, she is a dog. Or in the modern lingua, they are eating the dogs and the cats. They were repeating these words in public in the language of people who assume the position of masters, perhaps hoping to become masters themselves. Colonialism, imperialism, racist masters, sexist masters. In short, people suffering from what I consider to be a very deficient and dangerous theology. A theology that is confined, restricted, that is intent on creating privilege for a few, not value for the many. That is exactly the kinds of demons we were battling already. And so I looked at my mother to see what her reaction would be. In many ways, I came to embrace my mother's faith because of her determination. In that moment, I turned my attention now to the man. Determined like my mother, I started to speak. Sir, I addressed him. But before I could continue, my mother interrupted. Yes, but even the dogs, they eat the crumbs. This is one of those instances I didn't quite understand my mother. Did she just accept her status? Then I turned and looked at Jesus. If he didn't want to help my mother and me, that's fine. But why the insult? The crowd was now completely fixated on me and my mother. I walked up to where she was, still kneeling. She opened her arms and welcomed me with a big hug. As we held each other, I heard the man Jesus speak to my mother, "Woman, your faith is great, your desire is granted." Just like that? Well, in many ways, what I have learned since my mother and I walked home is that the struggle for liberation often includes severe costs for the people who dare to do it, including public shaming, public abuse, intimidation, rejection, brutal force, sometimes even death. My mother was training me for the fight and was using her own body to put herself on the line for someone she loved dearly. That was me. I knew then that if I were to pick up the fight that my mother fought, I had to prepare myself. This demon is no easy one to overcome. It requires the best of minds, the best of hearts, and the best of courage. Modern scholars wonder what to do with this Jesus. I turned around and I looked at him. I had a question for him. Did my mother have to endure all of this public humiliation in order to secure my healing, which was her desire? He said no. So I asked him, why then did you do it? Why did you subject her to all of that? That question then sparked an ongoing conversation. Matthew doesn't record that. Luke doesn't. Mark doesn't. But that conversation lives in our communities, in our bodies. And those of us who are committed to the work of liberation. And here is how some of the conversation unfolds. What is it that people who are committed to liberation, what is it that they must do to avoid reinscribing the systems that they fight so hard to overcome? What is it that people who are committed to the work of liberation must do to ensure that the story of liberation does not become a story of conquest? What is it that people who are committed to the work of liberation must do to ensure that the story of liberation is not about looking for single heroes, but rather thinking about the heroic work of entire communities and lands and peoples? Those are the conversations that I continue to have in my own community. I thank my mother for her courage. What she handed over to me was a struggle that preceded her. I now understand that it is a struggle that would far outlive my own life. But what I have learned is that in this space of liberation work, everyone who is committed to that kind of work is called to do three things. Offer a real alternative to erasure. Offer a real alternative to marginalization. Convince people that the long-term value of liberation is not in looking for and celebrating single heroes. It is in embracing the heroic work of ancestors, the present generation, and the generation to come. Because the answer to the question must be big enough, bold enough to far outlive our own existence and time. Only such big thinking is capable of responding to the systemic injustices that often cause liberation, to stall or to falter. Because as we know, Pharaoh will follow you after you have left Egypt. The question is, what are you doing when Pharaoh shows up? I hope we are building a new community that shows him that imperialism is not the only way. There's a real alternative. Thank you. So we have some time for conversation, questions, comments. I'm going to stop sharing.
Dr. Ngwa, thank you for this lecture. Thank you for coming here to United and for educating us, students, faculty alike, and alumni alike. Dr. Ngwa, I heard I heard your presentation as myself a Semite who speaks Arabic. The Rahm and mercy and womb points on these terms resonated very much with me. And I have a question pertaining to this passage from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is the paragon of virtue within Christian religion. And how can we see him as such in this text? What I hear in a recitation of these verses is either, in one sense, it risks looking like Jesus is not virtuous, or at best, Matthew is not virtuous, or leaving out important details. How can we come to see this as a text of virtue?
Thank you so much for that question. It is a question that I myself grapple with. How do we come to see Jesus and this text as a virtuous text? One of the things that I have struggled with in my own scholarship is whether the biblical texts always offer us examples to follow, or that they are doing something slightly different, which is to say, is Matthew presenting Jesus this way as the next Moses, in the same kind of way that the Hebrew Bible sort of presents Moses as this person who works for liberation and is caught up in this tension between liberation for a particular people and liberation for everybody, where that tension is palpable, and that the scripture then invites us to say, for those who are committed to this kind of work, to see that tension and to see how, if we don't pay attention to that tension, it can pull us back into a place of ethno-nationalism. And so Matthew is presenting Jesus in this way, which is why sort of the woman Maidrand approach to me says, there has to be more about this story that Matthew hasn't said, or Mark hasn't said, but that perhaps lives in the communities in these kinds of questions. What kind of liberator is this? Is he committed to everybody or just to some people? And so that if we ask that question, then we continue to read about Jesus' own presence in that region, where Jesus would then go on to feed people, to be more sort of magnanimous and generous, and that is something that is happening as we think about this multi-ethnic coalition of people that is coming together. So that eventually the ethical reading here is to move beyond sort of an interest in whether Jesus was a moral exemplar, which from the standpoint of faith, he was as a liberator. But the work of liberation often means that we move into an ethical space. It's not just important that I be a morally upright person. It is equally important that in that shared work, it is about the community, right? So as Dr. King would say, you might not convince the racist person to love me as a Black person, but if you pass legislation, it will keep them from lynching me, right? You move it to that level where it is no longer about the individual morality. It is about a shared commitment to work that guarantees the survival and the flourishing of everybody. So that's how my reading is trying to grapple with what is clearly a challenging question. And for me, the mother's formulation around womb, rechem, is something that I find quite appealing.
Can I, as a token of,
You don't have to
gratitude-
write something.
No, no, no,
I'm just saying.
no,
please
no,
go.
no, it's just,
Yes.
it'll be easier for people to see and hear, I guess, and in honor of you, Dr. Ngwa. Can I offer a token of gratitude? So, uh, coming from outside of Christian religion, being a Muslim myself, so I cannot speak, of course, as a theologian of this text. But it seems to me that there's a key with this term that you're using, a second Moses, that you used in your lecture and here. As a token of gratitude, I just want to share this reflection that comes to my mind hearing that. I think if we go beyond thinking beyond wrong and right, beyond the question of wrong and right, there seems to be a transition here, perhaps, in the role of Jesus as just a rabbi tending to one part of the body, sent to one particular people, to now what let's say from being, say, an optometrist to now a doctor of the whole body, some kind of symbolic movement here, beyond question of wrong and right, a symbolic movement, because it's not right for an optometrist to work on another part of the body. It would be wrong, in a sense, and without heavenly permission and without also the capability.
Correct.
It seems this is a movement from being a second Moses to what the religion comes to know him as, which is the second Adam.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. Thank you. There is.
Dr. Ngwa, I love your imagination. I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah. I love the story also that you shared with us. I'm not a biblical scholar. Put that out there. No. But is it not the case that that the Canaanites were supposed to be obliterated from the face of the earth? Is that's part of the story, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So from my point of view, being the badass womanist, that I'm trying to bring that to it. Jesus was not the most powerful person in that story. It's the mother. And I wonder if you were to use this story as a case of liberative imagination or engagement, what should Jesus have said to his disciples who were trying to shoo her away?
Yeah. So thank you for that wonderful question. What should Jesus have said to his disciples? I think Jesus would say at least two things. One is, in addition to saying to the woman, your faith has made you well, which is that you are the author of your liberation. That is, this liberation work is a result of your own work, right? Jesus should have also said to his disciples, you see that woman, that badass woman? That's how you should be. A badass womanist. Which is that it is this unrelenting capacity to basically, refuse to accept the marginalization as norm, but also to provide the kind of generative epistemological repositioning that allows for a different kind of future to emerge. So that she doesn't have to be at the bottom picking up crumbs, which is not, in fact, what she's asking for. So I think Jesus should have said that to his disciples. You see that woman, that is how you should be. Which would be consistent with some of the other things Jesus has said in the Gospels, right? Including the woman who gave everything, right? The widow's mite, which to me has often also raised important questions. If she gave everything she had to live on, what happened to her the next day? Which is the question that the community has to answer. Because again, this is about the heroic work of community, not about identifying individual heroes. And if there is a system in place that is causing this woman to have to give everything she had to live on, she has literally sacrificed herself. And then the question becomes, what is the response of the community, right? So in answer to your question, that is what I would imagine Jesus saying to the disciples, which would basically invite them to abandon the ways in which they were trying to be masters, right? Trying to be the dominant ones, trying to claim position and power, trying to create privilege for a few, not value for the many. And that is what hopefully the disciples would take.
It seems to me that this is a learning experience for Jesus.
Yes.
I mean, he doesn't know everything, before the whole thing starts.
Yeah.
He's learning like the rest of us.
Yes. I think that's why I try to present Jesus as what I understand to be what Matthew is doing as a second Moses. As we see with the stories of Moses, there are moments when he's learning, and part of what I take from my own reading of that story, Moses and Aaron and Miriam, is that it is actually a group of people, so that whenever we think about the Exodus story, you think about Moses and Aaron and Miriam, not just Moses. So Jesus too has this entourage, right? The disciples are very much a part of Jesus's own journey in this work, and he's learning.
I have some unformulated thoughts. I'm Carolyn Pressler. I'm thinking that Jesus is a second Moses, but I'm also remembering the story in Numbers 12, when God has to learn the lesson from Moses and Aaron to not oppress Miriam with leprosy. I mean, there's parallels, right? That the ones we usually think of as the good have so much to learn from the ones seeking liberation. And I'm not sure where to go with that, but I loved when you said you have to think of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam together. So maybe I just want to say thank you to that, because it's getting my mind to spin.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for articulating that. That passage in Numbers 12, I think it's consistent in the sense that beginning in Numbers 11, this is where a community that has been liberated is thinking about the value proposition of liberation is that people are freed from ideologies and practices of oppression that privilege a few. And beginning in chapter 11 in Numbers, people are gathering around the tent and around the camp, and people are prophesying, and someone comes to Moses and says, you know what? There's these two people who are out there, they are prophesying, they didn't come to be present do you want us to go stop them? And Moses' response was, no, 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 let them do it. Let them do it. Don't stop them. And then in chapter 12, we have that story where it seems like something is happening. There are people within the community that want to portray Moses as this exceptional individual. And Miriam challenges that and gets punished. But do you remember what happened in the story? So long as Miriam is not in the community, everybody is not moving. That story of liberation stops. When Miriam is marginalized, everything stalls. So as Will Gaffney puts it in sort of that midrash, they sat on their behinds, didn't move as a protest until Miriam returned. Then the liberation story continues. So to your point, that's part of what's, even though God sort of is making the case that Moses is an exceptional person. Moses can speak to God mouth to mouth. It's not like others who have dreams or visions or whatever. There are other epistemological spaces in the community, but this one is so unique and distinct and only Moses has it. And Miriam's like, no, that cannot be. That cannot be because it's going to carve out an exception for Moses. And for me, in a post-colonial setting, I hear that and the alarm bells go off because that is how you create the space for the post-colonial autocrat. I am the exceptional one. I am the only one that can be in this space and I can stay in that space, nobody else. So I immediately go into resistance mode. No, that can't happen. And I am grateful that Miriam spoke up. So Miriam's dissent against singularization.
It seems if you follow the logic about singularity and the heroic figure, and you use that lens to reconstruct Christology, it would be a phenomenal way to think about body of Christ, move beyond exceptionalism toward radical inclusion. That sort of thing keeps me up at night as a theologian.
Would you please write that book? It will be fabulous. It will be wonderful. I mean, I think you just opened up another space that I didn't even sort of go in there because, but it is.
Oh, maybe you should.
No, now that you mention it, I mean, seriously, that kind of reimagining of the Christological body beyond singularity is, thank you for that. Thank you for that.
So with that cracking of the theological can of worms, maybe we'll end the discussion there. Kenneth, thank you for inviting us into this work of imagination, of costly and creative and playful imagination around the necessary work of liberation. Can we offer some thanks to Dr. Ngwa? So as you close up shop, I will offer up a word of gratitude as we enter into our mealtime together. So you can take whatever posture you'd like. Ground of being. that which is beyond us. Allah, God, we thank you for such a wide mercy and abundance that allows us to gather together in this space, in these multiple spaces. We are so grateful for a good and challenging word from our dear brother about how we might continue to do the difficult and imaginative work of liberation in our community. It will be costly, and it will allow us to live. We are grateful for the nourishment that will go into our bodies, the soil and seeds and microbes and sun and water that formed it, and so many hands that have touched it along the way. Friends, let us break bread and get on with dreaming about liberation. Amen.